Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and a warm welcome to today's webinar, which is brought to you by Shared Services Link. Today we're looking at e-invoicing in the public sector, specifically where do the benefits exist, and really how do you practically get started. So today we're really zeroing in on the Camden Council story. My name is Susie West, and I am your host for today. I am the founder and CEO at Shared Services Link. And I'm very pleased to be presenting as our guest speaker for today Andrew Coulson, who is Head of Purchase to Pay at Camden Council and has been absolutely instrumental in their e-invoicing programme there. You of course do have a very important role to play, which is to make sure that your questions, which were enough to compel you to register for this webinar in the first place, are answered in the next 60 minutes. So there are a lot of nagging questions around the subject of e-invoicing that can sometimes impede your adoption of e-invoicing. So really do use this forum to bring those questions to the fore so that we can address them and hopefully allay some of those concerns. So how do you do that? It's very simple. You've got a GoToWebinar box in your GoToWebinar panel marked questions. And all you need to do is just type your question into that box and submit it, and that will come through to me, and I will put your question to Andrew in the last 10 minutes of this webinar, so do make sure that you stay on for the Q&A session. In terms of the context as to why we're actually having this discussion today, it's been estimated that there are around 100 million invoices being transacted between public sector organisations in the UK each year, and that the majority of these invoices are still paper today, and that the associated costs with these invoices in their paper format amount to around £10 per invoice. So you can see here that the opportunities for savings are absolutely substantial, and at a time when there has been for quite some time, and increasingly so, big pressure on local government and government generally to reduce costs. This is a very kind of key time. 2014 is a key time to engage in programs like electronic invoicing when there are so many saving opportunities to be made. So what we're going to be doing today is, as I said, walking you through the kinds of benefits that you might be looking at, financial benefits and other benefits, and also just have a little bit of a conversation around what's stopping you potentially from adopting the e-invoicing at the pace that you might be wanting to, and look to allay some of those concerns so that you might adopt it a little quicker. And Andrew's going to be leading the story on all of this. So just before I hand over to our guest speaker, I would just like to ask a few questions to you, if I may. We've got 3 back-to-back polls, and this really is for us to understand a bit more about who we've got on the line today. So coming up, first of all, if you could share with me, please do tick the appropriate box which really does represent your situation. Where are you with your e-invoicing project today? You haven't started, you're thinking about it for this year, you're in proper evaluation of a potential solution, or you're actually in a buying mode right now. Maybe you've actually decided on a solution already and you've signed up and you're about to go live, or you've already gone live in the last 6 or so months. Or maybe you've been live for quite some time and you're really dialing into this webinar today just to pick up some other best practices to help you with your project. We do look to have over 70% of attendees responding to this. We're actually at a very low level with 38% of you responding. So we're not sharing this data today, so you can share this data in confidence that it will remain absolutely 100% anonymous. So please do share this with us. It's very useful for us to understand the maturity levels of adoption of e-invoicing within the public sector market. Where are you with your e-invoicing project today? You haven't started, you're thinking about it for this year, you're in proper evaluation or buying mode, you've decided on the solution, you're going live imminently, or you've just gone live, or you've been live for a while. 63% of you have voted, so that's a bit more like it. Thank you very much for that. And I'm just going to close the polls in 3, 2, 1. Okay, let's share these results coming up on your screen now. Let's see where everybody is at in terms of e-invoicing adoption. So a fifth of you haven't actually started, and that suggests as well that you're not even thinking about it for this year. So hopefully what you'll find from this webinar will kind of trigger a little bit of a shift in that thought. 40% of you are thinking about it for this year, but you haven't actually started the proper evaluation yet. And a note really for those people, it will potentially take you up to 6 months and maybe longer to go through a buying cycle for e-invoicing. So if you haven't started yet, or rather, sorry, if you're thinking about it for this year, but you haven't started a proper evaluation or buying cycle, do bear in mind that it does take typically, and this is a quick cycle, 6 months to actually work your way through a proper evaluation, select providers down to a potential 3, then draw up a contract with the chosen one, etc. It's quite an administrative journey, but well worth it, as Andrew will demonstrate. None of you have decided on the solution and are either going live or have just gone live, and 10% of you have been live for a while. So I think that's an interesting breakdown. Let's just hide that for a moment. I just want to move on to the next poll question, and I'll explain the rationale behind this question. So this is really asking about the volumes of invoices that you process on an annual basis. So this is the volume of invoices that come in to your accounts payable department on an annual basis. How many do you process? Is it less than 100,000? 100 to 250,000? 250 to 500,000? 500,000 to 1 million, or more than 1 million? Now we've got 17% of you responding. The reason, again, why we're asking this is because the scope is very important in your evaluation of what the business case might look like. Potentially the greater invoices, the greater number of invoices you have, the greater the savings. And you could sometimes argue the easier the actual implementation, potentially. So if you're processing north of 50,000 invoices per annum, then it's normally very clear that a business case exists when you're looking at kind of hard cost savings. There are other financial savings which aren't just around the cost reduction of an invoice, and we might talk about those a little bit later as well. So we're only 50% of you responding, so if you haven't responded, please do so. We would like to get up to the 63, please. So if you haven't, 63% responded on the earlier poll. So if you haven't responded, if I can urge you one more time just to tick that box that represents your situation, please. Closing the poll. I'm hoping for that 50% number to increase just a little bit, but unfortunately it's not. Closing the poll in 3, 2, 1. Okay, 50% of you responding there. And maybe what that suggests is that you might not know, and you can tick the box because you don't know. And if that is indeed the case, then one first project really for those people that might not have known what the actual volume was is to go off and find that number, because that number is key. It really does determine the kind of the scope of what this project might look like for you. So we've got 56% of you with less than 100,000 invoices per annum, and 22% with more than 1 million. It's quite interesting. Normally we see a bell curve when we ask this kind of question, and we've got a U-shaped graph popping up here. So interesting. Right, let's just move on to the final poll question before I hand over to Andrew. So coming up on your screen very shortly. This really does apply to all of you, please. And it's really just wanting to understand what's stopping you from being more developed with your e-invoicing program. And also I think now is a good time for me to just explain and define what we mean by e-invoicing program. What we're talking about here is system-to-system electronic data feed. So there's no creation of, there's no emailing of a PDF. It really is system-to-system touchless processing, where an invoice is being generated in your system and being transmitted as a structured data file and being received. The invoice is being created in your supplier system and sent to you as a structured data file and received into your system as an electronic file. So we're talking system-to-system processing. What's stopping you from being more developed in e-invoicing? Is it lack of awareness of e-invoicing? What is it? How does it? How would you roll it out? What does it mean for you? You're focusing on other projects, nervous about how suppliers might react. Maybe you can't agree internally. There are normally 3 functions that need to be aligned when looking at e-invoicing, typically, and sometimes a 4th. And they are typically procurement, finance, and IT. And sometimes they're not always aligned, these departments, so that can sometimes impede development. And maybe you're not sure if there's a business case. So we're only on 80% of you responding. Please do tick the box that is most appropriate to you. And if you haven't already responded, please do so. Closing the poll in 3, 2, 1. Let's have a look at the results. Coming up on your screen now. Lack of awareness of e-invoicing. So you have joined the correct webinar today. Focus on other projects. So perhaps that suggests that the case behind why e-invoicing is so compelling isn't clear to everybody in the organisation as to how compelling it actually is. Because I think once people have gotten on to how compelling it is, it will climb up the ranks of the priority list quite nicely. Nobody's nervous about how suppliers will react, which is interesting. That's a positive sign. And 13% of you cannot agree internally. Thank you very much for your participation. That's it for now on the poll questions. No more poll questions for the rest of the webinar. I'm very pleased to be handing over to our guest speaker, Andrew Coulson from Camden Council. Over to you, please, Andrew.
Hi everybody, just to say a little bit about me, just before we get into the detail about Camden. I used to be a local authority accountant. So for about 16 years I worked in various local authorities, and then I went to work for a reasonably well-known consultancy company for about 5 years, doing a lot of work in the public sector. Never went any near e-invoicing at all, to be honest, at the time. But since 2005 I worked for myself as a contractor, and actually first came across e-invoicing in a bizarre way because I was asked by the Director of Finance when I at Enfield Council about 6 years ago nearly. He had just this sort of sideways question about why have we got so much paper in our procure-to-pay function, and to basically go away and fix it, which was good fun. So since that day, fateful day a long time ago now, I've worked with 3 London boroughs implementing e-invoicing solutions and sometimes e-marketplaces as well. And I did actually work for a time for one of the suppliers, an e-invoicing e-marketplace supplier, working with universities. That was before I came to Camden. And I actually came to Camden just over 3 years ago as an interim head of purchase to pay, with a remit to bring them e-invoicing and make them savings. Since then I've become a member of the UK National e-invoicing Forum, and I've done speaking engagements about my experiences and Camden's experiences at the EU and in various forums in the UK, and always happy to talk to people about the experiences and help people get good experiences. So today's presentation is mainly drawn from Camden experiences, but I think most of the issues are very common and the solutions quite repeatable. So just a little bit about Camden itself, and I'm sure most people on the line will realise that Camden Council is a multifunctional local government authority in London, about 212,000 residents. It's one of the major centres of business in the UK. Lots and lots of businesses based here, and Google's new UK HQ is coming here in a few years' time when the office is built. Now, I think Susie in the introduction mentioned about the pressure on the UK public sector around budgets. Now, I think in common with most people, Camden's got a really big spending target, or savings target for Camden. The target for the first 3 years of the coalition government's been about £83 million, and that has actually been achieved, but there's another £70 million to find by 2017. So you can see that the amounts of money we're talking about are really quite huge. And although we'll talk about what we've saved in the back office, there's a lot to be saved. So obviously, in common, as again with most authorities, I think the emphasis has been on saying, well, what can we save in the back office to preserve front office services such as care? So transactional services such as payments really come under the microscope quite quickly. And you'll see from the slide, hopefully, that an e-procurement system was bolted onto the front end of the finance system, so CEDA Financials and eBuy. So eBuy was added to CEDA in 2007 for ordering, but nothing was done about invoicing. But there are about 70,000 e-procurement related invoices coming in each year, and then 4,500 to 5,000, about 4,700 e-procurement suppliers used each year, and that there's a bit of supplier churn in that. I think that most people probably recognise a similar profile. But what makes this project more achievable is the fact that you've got relatively few suppliers represent probably a very large volume or very large proportion of the invoices. So, in Camden's example for Camden there, 26 suppliers represent 50% of those invoices. So, there are some big suppliers in terms of invoice volume, and very many very low volume. So even that invoice tail, which I've seen in a number of other authorities and organisations, including in the private sector, that's a pretty common type of profile. And just to add a little bit more, the over 2,000 suppliers invoice fewer than twice a year. So there is a lot of very low volume stuff going on. But also just to say there, the e-invoicing supplier was actually put in place and procured long before I came to Camden, and I think this might be something I noticed on the profile earlier. The number of the callers on the line are actually live, but it's live. There's live and live. I think I would say there's technically live actually being used. It's different. They're not actually the same. But just to go back on, so why? I think people would see me as an advocate of e-invoicing, and I do really believe it can have a positive impact. So let's move on to why e-invoicing is a good idea. And I would just preface that by just maybe a little bit of a quick definition. In my book and my definition, e-invoicing is not somebody attaching a PDF of an invoice to an email that then requires manual manipulation or repunching into the finance system. What it is a paperless transaction, purely paperless, originating with the supplier and being transferred electronically without any manual intervention into the customer's finance system. And I would say that's usually through a third party or a third party piece of software. So costs, that is fundamentally the saving money is one of the main reasons for doing this. It's not the only one, but the business case did show, the business case that's done before my time, showed significant savings could be made by headcount reduction from the payments function by basically moving to e-invoicing. So I would say it's clear that it does save money in the invoicing and payments process, but it also saves money in the process for the supplier, which is a benefit for them. Again, depending on who and who does the estimation, how they're doing the estimate, the amount of money that could be saved from e-invoicing across the public sector, and it goes £2 billion upwards, depending on which documents you read, but it's a lot of money. And I would say, if done properly and with the appropriate rigour, e-invoicing can really improve your invoice compliance. It's certainly done that here at Camden, and invoice compliance and the quality of invoices you're getting in. Certainly, historically, I've seen lots of things that HMRC would probably have conniptions about being described as invoices, little scraps of notepaper that they have been processed as invoices with. They don't have invoice numbers, they don't have purchase order numbers, etc., etc. But e-invoicing gives you the option to embed validation rules into the workflow, so you can keep dirty invoices away from the council's finance system, and resources aren't spent on resolving issues that really shouldn't actually be tackled by you as a customer. So such as having to actually return invalid invoices. E-invoicing can stop those invoices ever getting to you. Examples of other validation rules that we have here are obvious ones, like checking for a valid purchase order. That, does the invoice actually quote a PO? Does it have some value left on it? If the supplier is quoting, asking for VAT, have they got a VAT registration number on that invoice? Is it a valid VAT registration? Does that supplier really exist on your system? And I think something that everybody would recognise is looking for duplicate invoices. So there are duplicate. We do a lot of work on detecting duplicate invoices, so we don't actually pay them, or we minimise them. We pay, and always trying to prevent payment rather than retrospectively ask for the money back. Obviously, paperless is a great advantage, I would say, of e-invoicing. Suppliers don't have to send envelopes. You as a customer don't have to open them in your post room. They don't have to get the invoice to the right place, because the e-invoicing system will workflow the invoices to the right place. You don't then have to file those paper invoices, keep them for 6 years plus 1, and then destroy them. All the destruction can be built into the system. So the filing can be linked to the finance system, and what we do here is basically we've given access through the file store, so if people need to see copies of invoices to support their budget management or the auditors, they can basically see auditable images of invoices rendered from the data. So the paper never existed, but something that looks like the supplier's invoice can be easily produced, and HMRC are happy with that. I would say one of the other things we can do and have done is we use e-invoicing to support prompt payment initiatives, and we've certainly done some negotiations with suppliers about paying them, should we say, early in exchange for discounts. And in combination with some auto-receipting work we've done on our e-procurement system, we actually can ensure that we actually meet those early payments and achieve the savings. A couple of things that come sort of late to the table in terms of where we are at Camden are things like the EU e-invoicing directive. It's not yet been passed into legislation, but we think it will be this spring. Is basically a directive which will force the public sector to accept e-invoices from suppliers, probably not until about 2020, but that is, I know that sounds a long way off, but in the meantime, the UK government, there is a parliamentary inquiry which is going on at the moment, which is probably going to report in April and recommend sort of wider adoption, and is going to be seeking an all-party support for this as an initiative for 2015. Now, as I say, there is an EU directive, and there are countries across Europe, such as Denmark, where we've had this in place for a number of years. And I think in Denmark it was mandated in 2005, actually enforced in the public sector much from 2008. So even if you're not doing it now, people will have to do it. And the wording is quite interesting as well about public sector accepting e-invoices. So if the supplier sends you an e-invoice, you will need to find a way of dealing with it. So moving on a little bit, so if e-invoicing is such a good idea, and I think I'd say it is, why did Camden not make more progress before 2011? So my remit was to bring them e-invoicing, even though they had already had a system in place. Why did they need me? I think it's a reasonable question. Now, there were obstacles to progress before 2011, and people might recognise some of these. The original business case, I said, it was very much around, well, if we can turn 100,000 invoices into e-invoices, we can reduce the headcount by this. But there wasn't enough consideration, in fact there was no consideration around the challenges about supplier adoption and how key this really is. I would say it's I do bang on about it a bit, but it is, if you can't get the suppliers to send you the e-invoices, there's no point in having the system. And if I can just say, when I arrived in January 2011, the system had been live for a couple of years, or certainly more than a year, but the only two live, there were two, I want to remember to say that to you again, two live suppliers, and they were the actual stationary suppliers to the council, and these have actually been sending in EDI files for years. And I actually knew these suppliers from another place, and they could do e-invoicing, and that had been done for years. So that was don't forget the need for a plan for supplier adoption. And actually, nobody in the business had actually been given that as a job to do, to work on supplier adoption, to work out who we should do and why. And the project had been led, the whole e-invoicing project had been led by IT rather than the business. So the IT officers have done a good job in building the infrastructure and putting in the interface between the e-invoicing system and making sure the validations worked and all the rest of it, so the files could come into CEDA. But what they hadn't done is think about, well, what happened next. So the project had gone live, and the focus had been lost. And alongside that, difficult processes, almost so difficult they're unused, processes for supplier identification and for supply cutover from paper invoicing to E have been developed by IT colleagues, but actually it got to the point where paralysis had set in, so nobody actually knew how to actually even use these processes. But it wasn't not all gloom and doom. There were a number of sound policies already in place, such as requiring POs on paper invoices, but those policies weren't actually being enforced. So the purchase to pay team has spent a lot of time trying to find out what purchase order should have been quoted on that invoice, by trying to work out who probably would have ordered those goods. So you can imagine that was a complete waste of time. And I have to say I stopped that quite quickly. The team was very good at fixing things over and over again, rather than solving the problems at source. So I think, again, whilst the business case indicated headcount reduction, there wasn't much of a benefit realisation kind of plan either. So I've kind of picked up most of these problems quite quickly. And one thing I had forgot to mention there was that it actually had multiple payment teams until 2010. So each directorate in the council had its own payment team, which each had its own way of doing things. So you can imagine then that made things interesting. Maybe an interesting might not be the right word, and a little comeback on people for not following processes that do exist. So once we decided to actually really cut through all this, when I joined quite early on in 2011, then you actually doing implementation, you come across a set of other barriers when we start to really try and get suppliers on board. I think practical issues that I think we should all be aware of, and I think it'd be great if some bodies thought they were better at this than others, but I find it quite difficult, historically it's difficult to look at that 4,000 odd supplier database and be confident that we've got the right contacts, that we've got the right names, we've got email addresses that work, we actually have, we know who to talk to get suppliers to switch to e-invoicing. So in Camden's case, and again previous boroughs, the same problem, out-of-date names, email addresses not on the supplier database because the suppliers basically predated email, and nobody had ever actually gone through and added email addresses even for emailing of orders. So we were actually realised that orders were being faxed or posted out, so there's work there to do as well. It's worth, I would say, it's worth the effort of getting some decent data, certainly from the bigger volume suppliers, where you might want to do sort of more complex e-invoicing exchange. Not necessarily such an issue when you've got very small companies and SMEs with quite easy to find who to talk to. Of course, that will give you some other issues around technology. Now, I would say sometimes suppliers do take a long time to respond, and actually can be quite frustrating with working with some suppliers, where suppliers say yes, 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 we're going to do this, and then nothing seems to happen. So occasionally we have to do some threatening of, like, you will do this or we'll stop paying you, or actually in some cases we did auto adoption where we basically sent them their login details and said you're now live with E. So that was, we tended to do that more. We did that as a specific policy around some low volume suppliers last year, just because it's a simple way to get large volumes and met very low resistance. But one of the other barriers is some of the suppliers with complex systems at their end needed time. Our major food supplier took about 6 months to actually work out how to do e-invoicing, working with our e-invoicing supplier. But they stuck with it, to give them the credit, because they could see that actually once they managed to work out how to do this with Camden and the particular system we use, that most of that work was probably repeatable. So there's benefits for them that they maybe not see at first, but there are longer term benefits. I say at the time when we started on suppliers, and may have changed as awareness rises across the UK, the first time that anybody had actually mentioned e-invoicing to them. So we were thinking, one of the things we thought would be an issue, could have been an issue, was that Camden would say, we'd like you to switch to e-invoicing and we use this system, but whereas potentially at the same time Westminster or Hammersmith or one of the other neighbouring boroughs might have been talking to them about saying, well, we want you to switch to e-invoicing and use this system, which we're doing a different one. That actually didn't turn out to be an issue, possibly an issue that might apply more now, obviously give some resistance. Some suppliers did not want to change to E because they thought e-invoicing is quite a frightening concept and they need complex IT systems and support. Now, my suggestion, strong advice, would be that if you do work with many small suppliers who don't have sophisticated IT, and I think many wouldn't, look at an e-invoicing solution which has low technological requirements to meet their needs. Because the system we use, all the supplier needs is access to the internet. So actually, some of our small suppliers actually do their invoicing through their smartphones, and so it's not an IT heavy type of project. Cost versus benefits. Well, Camden, we need to communicate for benefits that actually we're not asking them to pay to do invoicing. They will get benefits. Some of the best benefits for them actually, if we can say they'll save money on postage, etc. But that's not enormous amounts of money for most people. But actually, the improved payment performance, actually knowing the invoice has gone to the right place, because it's been workflowed to the right place, actually improves their customer satisfaction. Treating them as a customer as well, rather than them chasing payments and bringing, Lord knows how many people to find out where their invoice is. They know where it is. It's in the payment system, and actually, depending on which system you use, they can actually see where it is in the system, whether it's actually queued up to pay. We were very clear about the benefits for Camden, and some of those we have to communicate internally, and there's always communication. Communication can never be overdone, to be honest. We did quite a lot with suppliers and still have gaps. We did quite a lot with our internal buyers and requisitions, and we would still get examples where a supplier would ask a buyer, do I really have to go to do e-invoicing? And the buyer would contradict our advice and the corporate project and say, no, just carry on with the paper. Well, that didn't work very well for them sometimes, because actually that buyer couldn't pay their invoice. So I think when people realised that, they stopped they stop listening to the buyer so much and start talking to us. We did update the council's website to require e-invoicing and give a lot more information to suppliers. Now all new tenders require e-invoicing as standard. So we've had one or two suppliers sort of saying yes, we'll do this, and then winning the contract and then saying, oh, but can we do it later? To be honest, the answer is no. From us, it's always been that we needed, you need to do this now. And probably one of the bigger volume suppliers is our interpretation, the face-to-face interpretation supplier, and they actually ended up using a very low-tech connection method because that's all they could manage until they get themselves some more sophisticated connection. So why did we succeed? I think we did. Well, I think the project's been a success because we cut through all that convoluted supplier identification. We basically looked very quickly through our suppliers, segmented by invoice volume, looked at whether there were some real issues about why a supplier couldn't move over to E, almost with the presumption that they could, and then we provided numbers of suppliers to our e-invoicing supplier for adoption. So that's something that we as a council didn't have the resource or the expertise to actually do that piece of work, and that's something that I think people have spent too much time thinking about, and it's actually it's not that difficult to work out who you want to get onto e-invoicing. I basically used one member of the team who had a right mindset, who was IT literate, to sort of lead on to just basically working out which suppliers, checking whether there were clashes with other things that we were doing that would mean we shouldn't put them forward. And when we needed to, he worked with buyers to redesign some of their old, out-of-date processes around ordering and buying. Our e-invoicing suppliers, a dedicated team available to do supplier adoption, and actually that's basically pretty much what they do. And obviously because they're part of the same organisation, they can liaise well with their own IT, particularly if a complex connection method is being used or the supplier wants to talk about using something more complicated. We have some really good communication with our supplier, fortnightly update reports on where every supplier that we've given them to adopt was up to, telephone project updates every fortnight, and quarterly face-to-face meetings. That I think helps move things along very well. You can pick up issues quite quickly. So invoicing is free for suppliers for Camden. I've not worked yet with a public sector customer who doesn't want to provide free invoicing. It also helps, obviously, encourage lower volume local suppliers to move over, and overcomes reluctance, especially if you can combine it with them appreciating the other benefits. I think I've alluded to this already, but having that range of connection methods to e-invoicing, the options for suppliers of varying technical capability, from really back office integration down to very simple. They can log on to a portal and basically flip our order into an invoice. All they need to do is add an invoice number and a date, effectively. There's not much more to it for them. So obviously that means they can't. Most people, it's very hard for them to get an invoice wrong. In April 2012, we added scan and capture as another connection method for very low volume suppliers, or for suppliers that were on their way to E. We decided that for those, if you remember, I mentioned large volume of number of suppliers who are very low volume. We wanted to, at the moment, we're thinking not to move them to E, because if they only log in once or twice a year, we might end up with more of a support problem because they'll have lost their login details, rather than just actually sending us the paper. But we're keeping that under review as things go by. The validation rules, we've embedded, there are over 30 validation rules in the invoicing system, in the workflow. Some of those are basic HMRC rules, some are Camden's rules, and that means that suppliers have to self-service. for e-invoicing. Invoices that fail are rejected back to suppliers. We don't fix their broken invoices; they fix them themselves. So if they fail, they're rejected either straight through the portal, which means that they can't submit. If it's a file upload type connection, they get an email and a report that tells them which bits have failed, and scan and capture invoices that fail are posted back with a rejection letter which tells them why their invoice failed, and that's a standard letter. Now, adopting suppliers took some time. I think you realise from what I've been saying, and I think one of the things is about staying resolute and being consistent. And once the suppliers switch to E, just well, I would say do as much as you can to avoid them switching back to paper, and do not accept paper from them. Obviously, there might be a couple of weeks grace when you to things that are already in the post, but don't they? There's a cutover period, and that's it. And I think it's very, very obvious for me that it's obviously technology underpins all of this, and it's absolutely essential to make it work. It's supplier engagement and its business change are actually the keys to success. A very quick reminder of the chronology of Camden's project. So they started in 2008, again, long before my time, so I can't quite, I look back and don't quite understand why things took quite so long to get off the ground. But once the e-invoicing, once the decision had been made and the contract awarded, the hub was built in a matter of 3 months and interfaced to Camden's finance system. So that wasn't, whilst it was a job, it wasn't an enormous job. So say about 3 months. The issue then was about supplier adoption. When the payment teams were centralised, I think almost as a side issue in some ways, but I think if they'd been more decentralised still, that would have made it more difficult to enforce what we've managed to do. I arrived 3 years ago. We've now at over 1,000 suppliers. Okay, that's less than a quarter of all suppliers, but actually it's over 90% of all the invoices are actually coming in as E. And through, we're now actually realising over £500,000 a year in cost savings. I'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. Now, I have to say that
Andrew, just to let you know, sorry, Andrew, just to let you know, you've got a 2-minute warning here. Thank you.
Okay. Very quickly, we need to wrap up. Compliance improvements. We've massively improved our compliance in terms of the. We don't accept non-compliant invoices anymore. I've said supplier self-service. There's a lot. Suppliers realise they can't invoice incorrectly, which actually has a benefit in improved buyer compliance. So I'm conscious of time now and moving very quickly on. We have surveyed suppliers a couple of times to find out what they think. We have pretty good performance, especially around 10 days, and you see that suppliers are making some quite are giving us compliments about the service, which is nice to see. Obviously, the 96% within 30 days is good, but could be better. So the problem with there is not receipting on our e-procurement system. So Camden's benefits, just to summarise right at the end, say over 90% of invoices now E, 80% of invoices go straight through. We don't have to look at those at all. Secure digital storage, simple invoice retrieval, so wherever you are you can get copies, is actually helping us do our agile working. We save about 100 metres a year of storage space by not having to store that paper. I've mentioned contract and commodity price negotiations, and I've put the service through 2 restructures to basically reduce the headcount to realise over £500,000 a year in savings. So key messages from me before I hand back to Susie: supplier engagement, determination to succeed, and that will give you the substantial improvements in the supplier experience and enable you to realise significant savings. But now I'll hand over back to Susie.
And thank you very much indeed, Andrew. So please do use the next 2 minutes or so just to post me your questions. I have a question for you, Andrew. So additionally to adopting e-invoicing, is it also interesting as well to adopt other electronic payments, straight settlement solutions other than bank transfers?
Well, we mainly use BACS, and there's been a drive to move get suppliers onto BACS. So I think that is the main payment method. I think one of the other things we've looked at, but not probably done enough on yet, is really looking at the very low cost items. So if you're spending £5 or let's say, or £250 with a supplier, shouldn't we make more use of purchase cards potentially? I don't know if that's the sort of thing we're talking about there, but there's a sort of bit of a reluctance to do that on auditability, and also our procurement colleagues are very keen on looking at spend analysis, and we need to do probably more work on drawing that together. And also there's obviously an issue where we've got corporate contracts and somebody who's got a P card can actually go and to spend in a maverick way.
Andrew, do you, obviously a huge benefit that comes when using electronic invoicing to the public sector is being able to capture negotiated discounts. How much are you in a position where you actually have discounts to capture, and then do you capture the negotiated discounts because of your e-invoicing tool?
Right, well with, I'd say we do, again, not probably as much as we have, we could do, because so far I think it's only a very small number of suppliers. Procurement have negotiated with them on, effectively, rather than us having to capture the discount through the e-invoice process and actually prompt payment, we're actually getting the invoices that reduce commodity price. So we're actually capturing them up front.
Okay, good. Thank you. Final question. Do you have full visibility of the invoices that are sent back to the supplier? And how are the invoices stored? It says how are these invoices stored, or how are these stored, but I think it's how are the invoices stored. Okay,
well, two questions there really. No, if it's a rejected invoice, we don't see it because effectively, we don't have visibility of things that are rejected, and it's almost as if it was never submitted in many ways. And we use for the images, there's a version 1 deployment that's been attached to see the financials, and we get sent when the invoice file comes across every night from the invoicing supplier at 8 o'clock. It also brings with it the data that can be used for rendering the images, and if it's scanned, an actual scanned scan and capture invoice, those invoices do come across to version 1 as well.
Okay, good. I'm afraid we are out of time. Just a quick.
Sorry, to just finish. So anybody who's got access to either the e-procurement system, eBuy, or to see the financials, can view an invoice image.
Okay, that's perfect. Thank you very much indeed, Andrew. Acknowledgement to Purchasing Insight for helping us promote this webinar. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for your time and attention today, and we look forward to welcoming you next time. Goodbye.